Well, it's good to be here today. There's a lot of folks that will follow me that are much more versed in the programmatics of what we do as a nation and as a military. This that I'm going to talk about, and some of the slides you'll see, is less about the what and the when of a particular Air Force program, but a little bit more about the why. Because as an organized, trained, and equipped MAGCOM, we're more in the why and the execution piece. Part of the why is that crisis is no longer our contingency plan. Crisis is the norm. So whether it be a pandemic, a supply chain crisis, refugees, climate change, or a violation of a nation's sovereignty, crisis is the norm. And it's not the contingency. And so we have to accept that if we're ever going to be truly ready for it. As mentioned, defense programs, which you all came here for, is normally programmatics and equipment. And the equipment piece is important for Air Combat Command because we have 95,000 of the finest sons and daughters our nation's ever produced. And as an organized, trained, and equipped Air Force Major Command, it's important we get them the right equipment. We are the main Air Force provider to the Air Force component force employers, like United States Air Force in Europe and Pacific Air Forces and Air Force North and Air Force Cyber around the globe. And I just chatted with John Horigian yesterday about how well we're providing United States Air Force in Europe and EUCOM the combat power they need. The way we organize is to be ready for crisis before crisis, ready for combat before combat, and to establish unity of effort before it's needed. And the way we train is to ensure that the nation's airmen are ready for crisis, competition, and conflict. And we equip to control and exploit the air domain. But before we can fully utilize any equipment and before we can effectively train with any equipment, we have to be sufficiently organized. Form kind of follows function, and so much of our organizational construct over the past 20 years reflects a combat Air Force that was organized around Middle East operations versus one that's organized for crisis, competition, and great power conflict. We're emerging from 20-plus years of operating from large fixed bases, where we grew accustomed to uninterrupted command and control, the luxury to aggregate disparate units where the supporting uncontested logistics and supported by adequate air-based defense, which enabled us to control the rheostat of time. By any stretch of the imagination, that is not the modern warfighting environment we now find ourselves. And the warfighting environment we must now organize, train, and equip for. The Air Combat Command airmen understand that very well, so I want to cue a quick video made by them, not me, that talks about the combat Air Force organization we need to facilitate crisis, competition, and great power conflict.
Our world is changing. For 20 years, we fought admirably in permissive environments. We embedded into expeditionary wings, groups, and squadrons to dominate the air. Airmen who were crowdsourced from around the world arrived from separate units, shook hands, and went to work with their new teammates. We grew accustomed to operating from large fixed spaces protected by adequate air defenses that were supported by uncontested logistics and uninterrupted command and control. Our warfighters controlled the rheostat of time, meaning we controlled the ops tempo. We employed, we deterred, and we engaged on our timeline. In the wars of the future, we won't have such luxury. Thus, our way must change. Wars with tomorrow's adversaries will be unpredictable. To meet this challenge, Air Combat Command is transforming the way we organize and operate combat forces. First, our garrison wing organization must migrate from one that forms the battle staff to react to crisis to a proven construct of a standing A staff that supports group and wing commanders to ensure that we're ready for crisis before crisis emerges. Second, The Air Force must migrate away from readiness-degrading, ad hoc expeditionary deployments to a sustainable, predictable, capacity-based, and readiness-building 4-bin force generation construct. This will change our deployments, going through a 24-month cycle of 4 windows. Available to deploy, reset, prepare, and ready. To improve unity of effort in our aviation units, we are transitioning from aircraft maintenance squadrons to mission generation squadrons that partner with a complementary ops squadron. Instead of developing unity of effort during the deployment, this combat-oriented maintenance organization enables the 2 units to work together to establish unity of effort before a deployment. If an emergency challenge requires a wing-level organization, we will deploy an immediate response force certified lead wing that's organized, trained, and equipped to deploy forward as a tasked, organized combat team. These lead wings must show up with organic air-based squadron combat support. So lead wings will aggregate agile combat support airmen into a high-performing team that's ready for combat before combat, allowing us to rapidly deploy and deliver the base operating support needed for the lead wing to generate combat power. With any change comes new challenges and expectations. Airmen will be multi-capable, trained to excel outside their primary duties, like recovering, rearming, refueling, and launching different airframes. Our lead wings, or the combat wings that are established forward, will transition to a Wing A staff construct, optimized to aggregate and disaggregate Air Force capabilities and facilitate close linkage with numbered Air Forces and MAJCOM A staff, or Joint Task Force staff. Applying these changes, we will deploy with agility. Agile combat employment means striking hard and fast, minimizing our time within enemy range. Agile and predictable for us, deadly and unpredictable for adversaries. Crisis and competition are the norm, so we will be ready for crisis before crisis. Ready for combat before combat. We'll establish unity of effort before it's needed. Our when, why, and how has changed. Our world has changed. And we must change to meet the challenge or lose.
Okay, as mentioned in our organizational constructs that have had a lot of coverage, whether it's a pandemic, a climate change, geopolitical, supply chain, refugee, or combat ops, crisis is now the norm. So we must be ready for crisis before crisis. Following 9/11, in the week of somewhat chaotic panic sourcing of global force management, we followed that with another 1,000 weeks of somewhat chaotic counterinsurgency of the week, crisis of the week, global force management sourcing, which became reduced U.S. conventional capability, which has led to dangerously low levels of U.S. conventional deterrence, inviting peer aggression. Our 4-bin generation construct stops that downward spiral. Every championship team builds unity of effort before it's tested, before it's needed. Our combat-oriented maintenance organization builds operational maintenance unity of effort before it's needed in combat. And as mentioned in the video, if we have to push a wing size, wing level, command and control combat power forward, our lead wings, along with combat support provided by the organic air-based squadrons, will deploy forward as a task-organized, high-performing team. They'll utilize multi-cable airmen, trained and confident to execute tasks outside their specialty to execute agile combat employment in expeditionary environments with our expeditionary wings, organized for close coordination with the numbered Air Force MAJCOM, or Joint Task Force. For our training equity, we have to first consider the threat, the geography, and the characteristics of a peer fight, as well as our force structure. When you look through a lens of what our force structure is and what it is not, many folks perceive that the United States Air Force force structure is probably pretty close to what it was 31 years ago for Desert Storm. But that is an extremely dangerous misperception. To understand some of the challenges to quote unquote where we're going with respect to peer threats, you have to reflect on where we've come from. In 1991, our force was around 4,000 11-year-old fighters, organized, trained, equipped for superior training and superior weapons to fight a peer adversary, with our pilots flying around 18 hours a month and supported by uncontested logistics, uninterrupted command and control, and adequate air-based defenses, with our homeland shielded by defense in depth. 31 years later, we have a different force structure of about 2,000 29-year-old fighters, acclimated to Middle East operations, challenged weapon stocks, with pilots flying around 9 to 10 hours a month, with a peer environment of contested logistics, challenged command and control, challenged forward air-based defenses, and thinner homeland defense. It's just a different global security challenge and a different force structure where you pivot a 1990 force trained to fight a fellow superpower, you mitigate it to a regional fight, and now we're taking a 2020 violent extremist fight, our capability, and we're pivoting to great power competition. Just a different challenge. Where a nation's conventional force defines its conventional deterrence. Not only do we need to consider changes in the force, we have to consider changes in geography. For decades, the United States military organized, trained, equipped to fight a peer adversary, the Soviet Union. The requirements for every single fighter we've ever designed and built, from the F-86 to the F-35, were driven by this peer adversary. To maintain a technical advantage, to operate from European basing, to keep a competence advantage, a credibility advantage, and a warfighting culture advantage, and to ensure interoperability with our closest NATO allies and partners. We pivoted this high-end European Cold War machine designed to fight this peer adversary to a regional fight 31 years ago, to dominate in Operation Desert Storm. Now we must truly pivot a force that spent 30 years in the Middle East to face a new challenge. China knows that the bulk of any U.S. fighter force that would lock horns in a peer fight was designed for European basing for a Soviet fight. They know that it's been utilized and expended over 2 decades in a more permissive counterinsurgency environment. They know that our fighter force has gotten much older, and they know that our fighter force has gotten significantly smaller. They know that this area of operations has significantly more water and more distance, and exponentially less land, less ports, less rail lines, less communication infrastructure. Their anti-access, area denial defensive construct is designed explicitly to exploit the capabilities, limitations, and vulnerabilities of a NATO force design tasked to operate outside of NATO airspace. They've added exponentially more threat systems and networks to limit U.S. influence during day-to-day competition, and these threat systems are designed to inflict more casualties in the first 30 hours of combat than we've seen in 30 years in the Middle East. If you want to compete in these environments, it requires range, significant payload, advanced sensors, and advanced weapons. Those are the hallmarks of peer conflict. But not only did we design our force structure with Europe in mind, we designed our range infrastructure with Europe in mind. As you'd expect from an aerospace nation, our civil airway structure has grown up around the range infrastructure boundaries. So modern threats and distances means the physical range space is a requirement and at a premium. But unfortunately, in terms of size, it is not a growth industry. With the range space we do have, we've made significant investments in our top-tier range training ranges to more closely replicate a peer threat environment. But that said, there is no level of fiscal investment that would enable a physical range expansion to replicate the size and scope of an Asia-Pacific fight. And there's no level of fiscal investment that will let me legally replicate the contested electromagnetic spectrum of communications jamming, radar jamming, and GPS jamming that a peer adversary will transmit into a contested region. There are also limits to the amount of high-end adversary air that I can generate to challenge our air crews. To that end, we have to take our toughest combat challenges into the synthetic simulator environment. All roads to Desert Storm led through the Nellis Test and Training Range and Red Flag. The dynamics of modern conflict and the limits of our physical range infrastructure means that all roads to peer competition and conflict will go through our virtual test and training center and other synthetic training environments. Okay, now a little bit more to the programs that you probably came here for. We put a lot of requirements on our various programs, but I'd offer first amongst equals is a requirement to connect. If any asset in any domain can't connect, regardless if it senses or not, it can't share. It's tough to close a long-range kill chain if you don't have the secure waveform, the encryption, the redundant nodes and pathways, and the bandwidth to establish a long-range comm chain and long-range connection. We also have to win the advanced sensing scrum. Our adversaries have invested a lot to outsense and outconnect us in a robust EMS environment. We've always done well with sensing arena with our TPSY 75 radars, F-15C, and E3 Sentry. All these platforms have served us well, but they have also all literally voted with their sustainment that their time is limited. Advanced sensing and processing is key to sharing, and if we don't have all domain sensing, processing, and sharing, it's tough to have joint all-domain command and control. As mentioned, we have to connect. We have to sense, and we have to share. If there's a priority amidst our priorities beyond connecting, sensing, and sharing, is to ensure folks understand the relevance of our force possessing the requisite range, payload capacity, weapons capability, and for modern crisis, competition, and conflict. We've invested a lot as a nation, time, effort, and money into building a low observable force. We will not get a good return on investment from this low observable fleet if due to weapons limitations we have to push them into ranges where everyone's observable. Range payload weapons doesn't just apply to what we're acquiring, it applies to what we already own. We built the F-22 to kill Russian flankers, period. Yes, it has done great at employing GBU-32 JDAMs and GBU-39 small diameter bombs. In combat, we built it and acquired it to kill Russian flankers. But a different time frame means a different threat and geographic region, which means now I needed to go further, I needed to sense further, and I need to engage further ranges than its original design. This simple unclassified optic exemplifies what Air Combat Command is doing to keep up with the range, payload, sensing, and weapons across every major weapon system to ensure we can go where we need to go, win the connecting, sensing, sharing, and kinetic battle, and to win the long-range kill chain fight. All this effort has to come together with enablers. And like the rest of the combat air forces, we need to adapt to new challenges, new geography, and new concepts. There's two different command and control nodes here, a bit of agile combat employment on the left, and our traditional air operations center on the right. What you don't see on the left-hand photo is the fuel truck, the weapons loader, the wrench turner, the security perimeter, the larger comm node. In modern combat, we need our airmen to be multi-capable, to be able to use their tool as a weapon or their weapon as a tool. So again, thanks for your time today. A couple takeaways that we need for crisis competition and a pivot to peer conflict. We need our airmen to be able to adapt to new organizational constructs, new threat, new geography, new training methods, the requirement to connect, sense, process, and share with the capability of range, payload, and weapons, supported by key enablers. Again, thanks for your time. It was great to see everybody. I look forward to your questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand broadly so we can see you.
Can I throw up the first one, sir?
Yes, sir.
Did I just see you throw up the last slide with an E7 on it?
I think that was a correct visual ID. Yes.
Yes, sir. Could you talk a little bit more about, you talked about NGAD, you talked about the need for the fifth-gen missiles for
Yes, sir.
fifth-gen aircraft. Could you talk a little bit more about the command and control, both the GIMT and also the AMTI, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So for AMTI, air moving target indication capability, our E3 Sentry, and the airmen who sustained it and operated mainly Tinker Air Force Base, but also elsewhere at Kadena and Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, finest airmen on the planet. There is a reason that there's exactly 0 airlines on planet Earth that operate a 707. It's unsustainable. The last airline to operate a 707 airliner was Sasha Airlines from Iran. And so, although we've got awesome airmen on the flight line at Tinker, great people in the back shop, phenomenal propulsion working on TF-33 engines, we cannot generate sufficient sorties 1/8 of a mile away from a depot. And that's with the finest sustainment enterprise on the planet. The other piece of it is it goes to the sensors. The wedge tail that you saw, that I added the picture of, is from the Royal Australian Air Force, obviously. The RAF is also purchasing these 7. The Royal Australian Air Force is an air force of 14,378 airmen. 14,378 airmen. And they're 1/22nd to 1/23rd the size of the United States Air Force. The RAF is around 1/10 the size of the United States Air Force. And they also own E-3 Sentries. But they also realize that capability is only worth its weight if you can get into the air and all the sensors power up and you can use it. We will not win the air superiority battle if we cede the airborne domain awareness piece. And so a lot of advocacy, a lot of effort into making sure we have a minimum of a 4th-gen sensor, if not going to a 5th-gen sensor in AMTI. And so we advocate on behalf. I frankly don't care who makes it. I do care that we provide our airmen and our joint force with the air superiority they've come to expect, that our joint force is organized, trained, and equipped to operate with. Yeah, thanks. Yes, sir.
Hey, General, over here on your right.
Yeah.
Hi, Marcus Weisgerber with Defense One. I was wondering, I know we're only 2 weeks into this conflict between Russia and Ukraine,
Yeah.
but I was wondering what your thoughts were initially on Russia's surface-to-air missile systems, and how, if at all, that plays into your calculus when you think about the future aircraft you need in terms of a stealth versus non-stealth balance. Thank you.
No, thanks. If I understood your question right, Russia, Ukraine, Russia's surface-to-air missile systems, is that correct? A couple things. One, they're operating pretty well when they're operated by Ukrainians. The second of all, in all fairness, Russia has, they've come across a lot of challenges, and they're well documented in whatever news channel is your favorite. They have logistical challenges, morale challenges, et cetera, et cetera. But one challenge they do not have from their S-300s, S-400s at their main air bases, they do not have an air-based defense challenge. They just don't. Because they operate layer upon layer upon layer of S-300s and S-400s, as well as SA-23s, et cetera. The Russian Air Force has not adapted agile combat employment for a couple of reasons. One, in my opinion, they're not capable of doing it. Two, they don't need to. They can operate pretty safe from their main air bases with that layer of air defense over them. But the Russian air defense units, again, operated by the Ukrainians, they're pretty capable systems. And the Russians themselves, I think, and think is a key word, is that they're struggling with fighting Russian systems and they're not adhering to Russian doctrine. And we see the challenges they have. But we also see the challenge of what happens if your joint force is organized, trained, equipped to operate with air superiority and not remotely designed to operate without air superiority. What happens when you don't have it? Yeah.
Sir, George Nicholson, the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Several meetings I've gone to with the Marine Corps, they're saying the F-35 is not a one-trick pony, and what they're using the F-35 for is they said we can get behind the lines, use the amazing sensors on it to find targets, identify targets, data linking on all of their aircraft, moving that information back to other platforms, doing the battle damage assessment and striking it. So basically, they're saying we can do things with the F-35 that we don't need JTACs out there to do it with. The other thing is a former acting Secretary of Defense had made a comment that the F-35 is of no value, that he would have canceled it if he had continued as Secretary of Defense, and that he can't do any close air support missions. Your comments?
Yeah. If I understood the comment more so than the question, the F-35 can do a significant amount of sensing, whether it be target recognition, kind of GMTI inherent to the airplane. I'm lucky that at one time I was the token AARP member flying the airplane. And so it has a lot of sensing capability. Very often in a big red flag exercise, it will expend its weapons where traditionally we would go home once we'd expend our weapons. But the information that it puts out to the rest of the joint force is so valuable at air sensing, ground sensing, and data linking that we like to keep it out there to contribute to the rest of the joint force. I would push back on the quote-unquote not needing JTACs, because as technology progresses, the primitive endures, and you need eyes on a target sometime, and there's nothing better than a young airman who is our air, space, and cyber expert at 19 years old within arm's reach of that battalion commander, and I guarantee you they do not want to give them away. I didn't follow the last part of canceling the program or some programmatics of it, sir. I apologize.
Former acting Secretary of Defense
Yeah.
had made the comment before he retired. He didn't say any value of the F-35 is a waste of funds. Can't do close air support. The program should be canceled.
Oh, can't do close air support. Well, obviously the Marines have voted with their investments that it can do close air support, and actually does close air support really well. And when you've got weather, and you've seen what happens when Russians try to do any type of attack in the weather, they essentially are somewhat close to our Vietnam, Korean era technology. They have to get below the weather, drop dumb bombs from, frankly, not too proficient aviators. And that F-35 can stay above the weather, sense through the weather, drop through the weather, and stay safe from what's bringing down all these Russian airplanes. So I would push back on any ability of that thing not to be able to do close air support. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
General Kelly, over here. Valerie Encina with Breaking Defense. I know this is a policy decision, and I know that it's still being under consideration, but the U.S. is in talks with Poland about a deal that would allow them to transfer their MiGs to Ukraine, and then Poland would get some F-16s. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what F-16s those are going to be. Are those Air National Guard F-16s, and if so, would you have to do anything to speed up replacement aircraft to those units? Are these early block F-16s from the Boneyard? Can you just kind of clarify what's under discussion here?
Yeah, you're actually 100% correct. It's a policy question. But here's what I would offer, Valerie. It's not an invalid question, but the question is essentially a hypothetical. What we're going to do for step 7, and I don't know what we're going to do for steps 1 through 6. We do not have a lack of F-16s, whether it be in our reserve, guard, active duty, from our AMARG, et cetera. If the decision is made from the National Command Authority that those first 6 steps are going to take place, trust me, we will be able to execute step number 7. Frankly, that's not what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is, again, outside the scope of their combat command commander, is just a history of dictators when faced with these challenges. You know, and the escalatory piece that potentially is bigger than the contribution piece of a MiG-29 is dictators when faced, again, this is more the historian and less of the air combat command commander, dictators faced with the choice of either losing or using chemical weapons, choose not to lose. That's what, frankly, keeps me up more than where I'm going to source the F-16s from.